In part one, I left you with a name. Well, I left you with almost a name. I told you the world's first recorded perfumer was a woman who walked in what is now modern day Iraq in 1200 BCE. And then I made you wait. So here is her name. Her name is Tapputi. And the reason almost nobody in the fragrance community knows that name, the reason the tradition she started got reduced to a dupe chart, is exactly what part 2 is about. This is Arabian Scent Files, the only fragrance series that treats Middle Eastern perfumery as a subject worth studying, not just a place to find cheap alternatives. Every episode goes deeper than the bottle. I'm Zoba. Let's get into it. Before I tell you who Tapputi was, I need to place her. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the territory that today covers modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, parts of Syria, and southeastern Turkey. This is where human civilization as we know it started. Writing, mathematics, the first legal codes, the first real cities, all of it started in Mesopotamia. And as it turns out, perfumery started there too. Tapputi Kalim is her full name, and that second part translates to female overseer of the palace. So Kalim is her title, Tapputi is her name. Her job title was female overseer of the palace. So whatever she was doing, she wasn't a hobbyist. She wasn't just someone who just loved to smell nice. She held an official position in the palace, which was the center of power. Think of her as the head of the fragrance lab, the chief perfumer, the person whose name goes on the work, because part of what she was responsible for was creating scents and fragrances that was being used in the palace. She was doing that job in 1200 BCE, and she wrote everything down. And when it was discovered, what she documented was essentially a chemistry process. She distilled botanical materials like roots and flowers using water and heat. She filtered what she extracted. She combined the ingredients intentionally. Well, I mean, probably she experimented, but the final products were intentional combinations. They weren't just random. And she created a repeatable process she was able to document on a clay tablet so that it could be repeated and done again. That tablet is what was discovered, and it is the oldest written record of a perfume formula in human history. Essentially, it was the ancient version or ancient equivalent of a patent filing. Her name is still on that clay tablet 3,000 years later. This tablet survived the fall of Babylon, centuries of burial in the soil of Iraq, and excavation by archaeologists who had no idea what they were looking at until they got a chance to translate it. And when they did, her name was right there. Tapputi, her title was right there. Kalim, her process, her ingredients. Everything was documented as carefully as any modern lab would record or document things today. So remember that the oldest written record of perfume chemistry in human history was found in modern-day Iraq, written by a woman, and her name was Tapputi. Now, why have many people not heard of her? No? Do you know who Ernest Bo is? Probably not by name, but you probably know what he made. He's the perfumer who created Chanel No. 5 in 1921. His name is in every fragrance history book. It might not be on the TikTok videos or unknown, but people know his product. He's a figure in the origin story the fragrance industry tells about itself. Anywhere you go and they talk about the history of the fragrance industry, his product and his name shows up on official records. Well, Tapputi created documented fragrance formulas 3,000 plus years before Ernest was born. They were doing the same work, the same fundamental process. Equipment and things and methodologies might have changed, But essentially, what they were doing was extracting stuff, combining stuff, documenting it. But one of them made it to the history books. One of them most people in the fragrance community have never heard of. And I don't know if I'll say that's an accident or that's a deliberate choice about whose history gets told and whose gets buried. I mean, if you think about all the names we know, all the firsts, the people history decided to remember. If you think about the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, you might know that one. Think of uh Rosalind Franklin. There are just so many firsts that we know, but we don't know that the first person to document a perfume formula in recorded human history was Tapputi. She was essentially the Rosalind Franklin of perfumery. She was the woman whose contribution is right there in the primary source on a clay tablet that survived all these many years, many centuries, and who still somehow hasn't made it into the story the fragrance world tells about itself. Right now, if you ask most people to talk about the fragrance industry or the history of it, the story almost always starts in France in the 19th century, and that story isn't wrong because French perfume is extraordinary. But that's not the start of perfumery and the industry. It didn't start in France, it didn't start in the 19th century. It's all the way back, goes all the way back to Tapputi. Probably even before her, but in terms of history records that we're able to reference and take a look at, she's the beginning of it. I say all that to say the Middle East is not an alternative to a perfume tradition, it is the birthplace and the origin of one. Tapputi was part of a civilization that had been living with fragrant materials for centuries before she even picked up a stylus to record her process. There were temples that were burning aromatic resins as offerings to the gods. The word perfume itself comes from perfumum in Latin, which means through smoke, because burning fragrant materials in sacred spaces back then is where this whole tradition began. Like they believe that the scent or the fragrance in the smoke as it ascended made its way to whoever they were serving or worshipping, and that was part of their culture. Those materials they burned and used, someone had to grow them, someone had to harvest them, someone had to carry them across the ancient world. And that's where our story will take us to next. So we'll take a look at the incense route. The ancient world ran on fragrant materials the way our world today runs on oil. Fragrance was not a luxury. It was not something that was nice to have. It was something that entire religious systems, political structures, entire economies could not function without. Every major temple burned frankincense. Every significant ritual required it. The Roman Empire alone, imagine this, the Roman Empire alone imported an estimated 3,000 tons of frankincense a year. 3,000 tons every single year. And they didn't even have the kind of transportation methods we had today. And yet it was just that important to them. And the people who controlled that supply, that 3,000 tons to the Roman Empire and to whoever else wanted those materials, the people who controlled that supply for 500 years were Arab traders from the Arabian Peninsula. And that is the incense route. It is one of the most significant trade networks in human history. The frankincense producing regions in the Middle East were in the southern tip of what is now Oman and Yemen, and the Horn of Africa, which would include, I believe, Somalia. Those were the only places on earth where the Boswellia tree would grow. The route carried it roughly 1,500 miles northward by caramel caravan into Egypt, Greece, Rome, and beyond. And the cities that sat at critical points along that 1,500 miles became extraordinarily wealthy Not because they were producing anything, but because they sat between the source and the customer. And they charged a fee on every single thing that passed through, which, that's extraordinary. The most extraordinary of those cities, or a really great example of those cities, is Petra, the rose red city in modern day Jordan. The rose red city that was carved directly into cliffs. Every beautiful stone building in Petra, every sophisticated water channel, every piece of that city was built on frankincense money. The city was funded entirely by sitting at the northern end of the Incense Route and charging a fee on every caravan that passed through. Now, that is what controlling a fragrance supply chain looked like in the ancient world. Now, the frankincense itself. It comes from the boswellia tree. You make cuts in the bark of the tree, the resin bleeds out, it hardens, and you collect it. And the smell is resinous, it's a resin, slightly clean when it first hits the air, but it begins to deepen into something that's woody and meditative. That kind of smell, when you walk into a place, makes you feel like something significant is about to happen. And that smell, that feeling it evokes, is exactly why every major religious tradition in the ancient world burned it. Egypt, Greece, Rome, the temples in Jerusalem, they all believed it carried prayers upward. You could not perform a ritual, a service without it. It was not optional. Every major religious tradition burned frankincense. Again, think Rome, 3,000 tons per year of something hand harvested from specific trees, carried 1,500 miles across the desert. That's not just trade. That's a civilization's dependency on this thing called frankincense. The way it was transported, the dromedary camel was domesticated in the Arabian Peninsula around 3000 BCE, and it can carry 400 pounds of cargo and go for days without water, which made it very, very valuable to Arab traders because it meant they could cross the vast waterless interior of the Arabian Peninsula, essentially the desert, quickly, relatively quickly, because they had a means of transportation, the dromedary camel, which could carry large quantities of goods, and they didn't have to give it water every single day. Essentially, for that period of time, they had the only technology that made the route work. Nobody else could do what they were doing. And it's not just luck. Essentially it's a civilization that understood its geography and had a wherewithal and the presence of mind to build something that took advantage of it. And they held that advantage for 500 years. That was very significant. What they were doing, the control they had over the transportation and the production of frankincense was very significant. Significant enough that the Roman Empire decided to launch a military invasion of the Arabian Peninsula because they wanted to break the Arab monopoly on frankincense. What the Roman Empire did was they sent an army into Arabia, specifically to get direct access to the frankincense producing regions, and they wanted to cut the Arab traders out. Fortunately, the invasion failed. Disease took out most of the soldiers before they reached anywhere near the frankincense trees. And then for the remaining soldiers that survived, Arabian resistance stopped them. So Rome never got what it came from. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded that Rome spent about 100 million of their currency every year on Eastern aromatics, every single year. And at that time, Rome was the most powerful empire on earth. He was very annoyed and irritated by the fact that the most powerful empire on earth was bleeding money, hemorrhaging money on fragrance materials it could not stop consuming, and fragrance materials it did not control the supply for. 100 million of their currency on fragrance. That should show, I think that shows or displays the weight of what the Arab traders had built and what they held. The people who ran that route for 500 years built a cultural relationship with fragrant materials that went all the way down into their culture, their hospitality, their identity, what it means to get dressed in the morning. The boldness of Middle Eastern fragrance, the projection, the longevity, the cultural weight it carries wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was, or it is, 5 centuries of being the fragrance capital of the ancient world, showing up in every single bottle that is made today. So the Middle East controlled the world's fragrance supply for 5 centuries. But then something else happened. They also invented the science that made modern day perfumery or modern perfumery possible. Let's go forward from Tapputi a little bit. Let's go to the Islamic Golden Age between the 8th to the 12th century CE. While much of Western Europe was in the early medieval period, Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, was the largest city on earth. Between 500,000 and 1 million people lived in the city. London, at the same time, had maybe 15,000 people. And at the center of Baghdad at the time was a place called the House of Wisdom. It was at that time the greatest research institution the medieval world ever produced. Scholars came across the known world to translate ancient texts into Arabic and then translate the already translated Arabic text into other languages. They didn't want to just preserve knowledge, they wanted to expand it. And it was across different subject matters: mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and chemistry. And in the chemistry of extracting fragrance, they changed everything. First person we want to talk about, or the first notable person in perfumery chemistry, was called Ibn Sina. He's known in the Western world as Avicenna. He was born in 980 CE. His medical encyclopedia was the standard textbook in European medical schools for 600 years. At that point, Columbus had not yet sailed to the Americas. And that was the time when European medical students were opening a textbook written by this man. And what he did for perfumery, he refined and made reproducible a process that is still being used today, and that is steam distillation. It's going to sound a little bit like a chemistry class, but let's explore steam distillation a little bit. Before steam distillation was a thing, perfumers were severely limited. So what they used to do was they would press flowers into animal fat and hope the scent transferred, or they would soak the plant materials, the roots, the flowers, the whatever, in hot oil, and hope that the scent transferred. Then they would burn it as incense. It was slow, it was imprecise. If you wanted to mass produce it, it was difficult to scale. But steam distillation changed everything. So how steam distillation works is you put the plant material in something with water, you heat it until it produces steam. Then the steam, when you've set up your equipment, the steam passes through the material, picks up the aromatic molecules, travels through a cooling tube, and then turns back into liquid. So you end up with two things. You end up with essential oil. That's the concentrated pure scent floating on top. And then you end up with hydrosol, which is the aromatic water underneath. A very, very great example of hydrosol is rose water. Like we use rose water as a skincare ingredient. It's added to things. There are bottles of rose water in certain traditions or cultures. Rose water is used for cooking. That rose water is a product of steam distillation. So if you distilled rose, you would get rose essential oil and you would get rose water as well. And so rose water back then was not only used in religious rituals, but it was also used in Middle Eastern cooking. And steam distillation made this really possible. How expensive it is to distill rose. 1 gram of rose, that is, well, 1 gram of pure rose essential oil requires approximately 1,000 rose blossoms to produce. That's how expensive it is to get rose essential oil or rose water. 1,000 roses to produce 1 gram of pure rose essential oil. The technology that makes it possible to concentrate 1,000 roses into a single gram of oil was refined in the Middle East, not in France. And like I mentioned, Ibn Sina was one person. He was not working alone. There was another scholar named Al-Hindi who was working in the 9th century, actually even before Ibn Sina was born. And he wrote what is considered the earliest dedicated book on perfume chemistry. He had hundreds of documented recipes and distillation techniques. It is the first perfume manual, and it was written in Arabic in the Islamic world. Then there was another person, Jabir ibn Hayyan. He's often called the father of chemistry. Well, specifically chemistry broadly, but also perfume chemistry, because he developed at that time, way back when, he developed the distillation tools that the entire field was built on afterward. His Latinized name was Geber, and European alchemists for centuries cited Geber as a foundational authority. They built on his work and they referenced his methods, even when creating not just distillation techniques, but equipment as well. They referenced the work he had already done. But they were doing it without always making it clear that Geber was Jabir ibn Hayyan, that this foundational knowledge was written in Arabic by a scholar in the Middle East centuries before European science reached a comparable level. So the knowledge traveled, but the credit did not always go with it. And you can see that is a pattern. So we have the first person to document perfume chemistry in what is now modern day Iraq, and that was Tapputi. You have the people who controlled the world's aromatic supply chain for 500 years, the Arab traders. You have the science that every modern bottle of fragrance depends on, between the steam distillation technique and distillation equipment and fragrance recipes. All of those were developed in Baghdad. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about Middle Eastern perfumery. Those are details that are important to remember. So let's go back or talk about Latafa's opulent oud. In part 1, I told you I was looking for the thing that makes Middle Eastern fragrance distinct, and I found that the one thing I was running from oud was the door I had to walk through to get there. And so I want to talk a little bit more about oud, the doors it opens, the tradition it draws from. That Latafa opulent oud, the one thing I love about it is the way oud and rose plays together in the fragrance bottle. I love the longevity of the fragrance. I love the projection, the density. It all came from the attar tradition. So my little bottle of Middle Eastern fragrance comes from a tradition that is centuries old, an oil-based perfumery tradition that gave Middle Eastern fragrance its richness and its staying power. All that details is not written in the fragrance box when you buy it, but it's present in the bottle. In the way the fragrance performs, it's created based on a foundation of centuries of fragrance culture. Latafa opulent oud costs less than most restaurant meals, and yet it's carrying one of the longest and most significant fragrance traditions in human history. That kind of discovery is why Arabian Scent Files here. It's part of why I've created this series and why I love it so much. Every episode, every house, every bottle, we're gonna dive in deep. We're gonna take a look at tradition. We are going to take a look at culture. We are going to take a look at the history of this wonderful thing called fragrance. So in part 3, we are going from ancient history into the living tradition, the attar culture, the mabkhara, the Gulf fragrance practices that connect everything we've learned so far from the ancient world to what is happening today, the modern world. And after that, we'll get into some bottles. So subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave me a comment. What surprised you the most about what you've heard in this part? I'll see you in the next part.